Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. Today we're going to go back to Peter Brown's book, The Love You Make. It's been quite an adventure, and it's been interesting to find out information from his point of view, whether it's true or not. It will be up to the viewer to decide, and if you have any information that you know about any subject that comes up in this book, please be sure to write it down in the comments. I know we would all be interested in hearing about it. So let us find out what happened today. The success of Sgt. Pepper had the Beatles feeling like they were affecting people in a large way, so they started to create songs with messages. Their message for the summer was love. It was a song to give everybody hope. The song was All You Need Is Love. It was like an anthem. Brian got the idea to give a party at Kingsley Hill to celebrate love and LSD that everyone was caught up in. He didn't mean for it to be an acid party. Brian got the acid from a San Francisco acid chemist named Owsley, and they came up with a plan to get the acid to England. That June, the first major outdoor rock festival was taking place in Monterey, California, not far from Owsley's laboratory in San Francisco. The Beatles knew the film rights to the Monterey Festival had been sold exclusively to an American film company, but they sent a large complement of film equipment to San Francisco in order to film the festival, but that wasn't the case. When the camera crew wasn't granted permission to film, which they knew would happen, the airtight camera lenses were filled with liquid LSD and shipped back to England with no issues. Several pint-sized vials of this LSD were on the bookshelves in the sunroom at Kenwood. Others were converted to convenient little pink pills, and they made their way to the Beatles' inner circle. It was strong stuff which made it hallucinogenic and electric. The guests at the party included the Beatles and their friends Mick Jagger, Marianne Faithfull, Lionel Bart, Sir John Pritchard, Kenny Everett, and Nat Weiss, who flew in from New York just to be there. Derek Taylor and his wife were invited too. He was given round-trip first-class plane tickets from Los Angeles, and he had moved to California a year before. Brian was in a good mood when he had seen Derek and told him his book, A Cellar Full of Noise, was still selling well, and Derek had helped ghostwrite the book. Brian thought that Derek had perhaps not been compensated enough, and Derek said that his contract was lost long ago. But then Brian generously pulled out his checkbook and gave Derek a check for an additional £1,000. When Derek and his wife Joan arrived at Heathrow after dawn on the Saturday morning of the party, they were greeted by John and Cynthia, and George and Patty were at the airport too. They were dressed like wizards and fairy princesses in costumes of purple and yellow satin. They had flowers and bells around their neck, and they were accompanied by 3 people who came up with the costumes, and they were called the Fool. John and George said the plan was to drive to Kingsley Hill and arrive before the other guests. All 9 of them got into John's Rolls Royce, which had been psychedelically painted. Derek said the inside of the Rolls was just as different inside. John had a tape deck and a studio-quality turntable suspended on a platform. The door had quality speakers, and John put on Procol Harum's Whiter Shade of Pale. A thermos of tea was passed around, and Derek noticed that the music sounded extraordinary. Derek was about to ask what was happening when John said, "This was the first morning I had acid for breakfast, and you too. There's LSD in the tea." Joan, who was 7 months pregnant, didn't have any, but when she saw what was going on, she voluntarily took a dose herself. Then there was a small pill box, and an acid-soaked tablet was passed around in the car for them to nibble on. Cynthia was squished in between John and Patty, and she was the only one who hadn't started tripping. She had refused all offers, and now she saw the pink pill coming her way. She had tried a few times to take trips, but it only felt anxiety when she did. But today was such a festive day, she decided to try it to hear John's drum, as she put it. The party had a dreamlike feel to it at Brian's. There was good food and liquor and friends, and Paul phoned to say he wasn't going to be there. That put Brian in a bad mood. Brian was paranoid about Paul, and now he felt devastated that he wouldn't be attending. John and George rushed up to comfort Brian, and George said to him, "Come on now, Brian," as he hugged him. "We're all here, and we're good friends. We love you." At one time during the party, George found Derek and John curled up in the back seat of the Rolls, listening to A Whiter Shade of Pale for the 100th time. He went in there with them, and they felt warm and secure there and stayed a while. George told Derek that he never had to worry about anything as long as he lived. He said that he would always have us. So 9 months later, Derek and Joan sold their home and furniture in Los Angeles and moved back to London so that Derek could work for the Beatles. He worked for one or another of the Beatles ever since. Two people there at the party weren't having fun. Brian's assistant, Joanne Newfield, she became violently ill and threw up on Nat's shoes, and Cynthia wasn't enjoying her trip either. She had anxiety, and the gardens had melted. Strangers grinned at her with rubber lips. She felt like she would feel that way forever. So John was the only one whose presence calmed her, so she kept following him around. He didn't like it and gave her a look, so she went upstairs to the second-floor bedroom and sat on the bed for a while, feeling lost, and then she went to the window and watched the party out on the lawn. She felt like she could just step out the open window and float. She was getting ready to go out of the window when Patty called to her from the garden, and she said, "What are you doing up there? Come on down." Well, maybe she shouldn't have phrased it like that, but luckily Cynthia lay down on the bed. She stayed there until the acid wore off. One thought that filled her mind was doom. She knew that she and John were doomed. George gave up drugs after going to California in 1967. Paul had been to San Francisco after his birthday visit with Jane, and he told of the hippie movement. Paul made it sound like heaven on earth, and Derek Taylor showed George and Patty around. George took some Owsley LSD, and they were tripping when they went to see the hippies. George said he expected to be like King's Road, only more. He expected them to own their own little shops, and he thought they would be nice and clean and friendly and happy. From the limousine, George saw a slum area with a group of lost and disillusioned kids. They were on the street corners begging, selling incense, and lazing in the sun. They were barefooted and unwashed. Then George and Patty and Derek decided to walk around near Haight and Ashbury streets. The hippies parted in waves around him. Soon word got out that George Harrison was around, and the next thing there was about 1,000 kids who were stoned and tripping around him. Someone in the crowd had a guitar and handed it to George and told him to play it. George said, "No, please." He tried to return it to them, and someone in the crowd shouted, "Play," and then they began to chant, "Play, play." And George gave Patty a sick look. He tried to strum a few chords, but the acid made the cheap guitar feel like a lump of cheese. He tried to sing "Baby, You're a Rich Man," but didn't have the heart. He returned the guitar and apologized and tried to make a break to the car. They ran for the limo, and the crowd was behind them. Somehow they escaped unhurt, but it was a scary situation. When George got back to England, he was so disgusted he swore he wouldn't take another drug, a promise he didn't keep. When he told John about it, he said, "Well, it's not doing me any harm, so I'll go on with it for a while." Peter Brown said that one night he was in his office and he got a call on the Beatles' private line. It was John. He said it was restrictive to live in London. He wanted his own little kingdom, like an island. He said on the island they would build beautiful houses and the best studio money could buy, and they would have a school where Julian could be taught in a one-room schoolhouse with other children. Magic Alex had an idea. There was an island off the coast of Greece where there were thousands of islands that the Beatles could buy cheap. Peter got Magic Alex and Alistair Taylor to go to Greece to find the island. 48 hours later, Alex said he found a place. It was a tiny cluster of islands, 25 miles out into the Aegean, and it was 100 acres. There was a large main island with 4 secluded beaches and 5 smaller satellite islands. It also had 16 acres of rich olive groves on the island, which could bring in money. It cost £90,000. Magic Alex didn't mention that Greece was struggling under the most repressive military governments in the world. There were long-term and life sentences for small drug offenses. When the Beatles got there, Magic Alex told John before he arrived to behave himself at all times. And when the commercial plane got there, John got out of the plane, wearing a military jacket. He started to salute every soldier in sight. John was stoned and barely got out of the airport when he insulted a general who had come to greet him. John realized in a short time that he forgot his LSD, and what good was seeing the Parthenon without it? Alex wasn't about to look for drugs in Greece, and he called Mal Evans to say John wasn't well and he needed to bring him his medicine. When Mal figured out what he was asking for, he flew to Greece. And then Greece exploited the Beatles by driving them from location to location. The Beatles loved the islands. They wanted to buy it, but there was problems with money. The property would cost £95,000, and the Beatles were instructed to apply for the £95,000. They had to pay a 25% premium dollars from the English government. That was needed to buy foreign property. The Beatles' accountant said the Beatles had only £137,000 in cash, and it would be a disaster to finance the purchase of the islands. In the end, the Beatles released the islands because they were becoming a hassle. They sold the property dollars back to the government and made a profit of £11,400 in the process. Brian worried about the decision to buy an island, and he didn't trust Magic Alex. No one asked Brian to join them in Greece. Brian wrote to Nat that he thought the idea was dotty, but they were no longer children, and they must have their own way. At this time, Brian was having problems of his own. He regretted his association with Stigwood and Shaw. Stigwood had personal extravagances that he charged to Nims: turkeys from a butcher for Sunday dinners, article of clothing bought at Harrods, and then he took the Bee Gees to New York for a promotional trip, and Stigwood rented a yacht for them to sail around Manhattan Island, and he told Nat to charge it to as a personal account. Brian got mad and said, "What personal account?" When the Bee Gees were as successful as the Beatles, then Robert could rent them a yacht around Manhattan. Brian was hoping that they wouldn't be able to come up with the money to close the deal he had made with them, but they had no trouble coming up with it, and Stigwood said that Brian should inform the Beatles what was taking place. It was at this time also Cilla Black decided to leave Nims. The Beatles didn't have a problem with Brian's odd hours and behavior, but Cilla couldn't deal with it. When she tried to reach Brian, she would get either his secretary or butler, who made excuses for him, and Brian canceled and missed appointments with her and sent candy and flowers to apologize the next day. So at this time, Brian sent Clive to make a personal appeal to Cilla and Bobby to attend one last luncheon at Chapel Street. On the Wednesday morning of the lunch, Peter called to make sure that they would be there. Brian was nervous all morning. Peter joined them for moral support. Brian had the butler lay out the best silver and china and serve filet of beef and champagne. There wasn't talk about Cilla leaving. Later, just Brian, Cilla, and Bobby were up on the roof garden and stood at the railing looking over the city. Brian said that there were only 5 people I love in the world, and he had tears in his eyes. He said it was the 4 Beatles and you, Cilla. And Cilla hugged him tightly, and he said, "Please don't leave me, my Cilla, please," he whispered to her. The next day, Brian arranged a meeting with the BBC to produce a new series for Cilla, and it went on the air a few months later, and it became a sensation. It was called The Cilla Black Show. It was the most successful female variety show in the British history, winning Cilla the TV Personality of the Year award several years in a row, and it made her a star. So I will end the video on this high note, with Brian helping to make Cilla a star. He loved her and the Beatles, and I'm glad that he was able to help Cilla out and find her success as he did with the Beatles. In this episode, we found George to be disillusioned by drugs after visiting San Francisco. It wasn't the paradise there that he thought it would be. The hippies weren't clean, they were begging and selling incense, and then he almost got trapped by a mob who insisted he perform for them. Brian held an LSD party which caused Cynthia to almost go out on a second-story window to join the party below, and she thought she could float out to them. Patty sort of snapped her out of it so that she went to bed, which was the best thing she could have done. The episode seemed to have everybody on drug trips, and it was amazing they could function as well as they did during this time. So I learned a few new things in this episode, and it was interesting to find out. I'm more than halfway through the book. I look forward to seeing what other information we find out. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.